The year was 1854, deep in the heart of Georgia, a land where the air was thick with the scent of magnolias, and the screams that no one dared to hear. Louisa moved through the grand halls of the Whitmore plantation with quiet grace, her bare feet brushing against polished floors she was never meant to touch. The big house gleamed white in the sun, a symbol of power built on the backs of those who had no names, no freedom, and no mercy. Louisa was only 22, but her eyes carried the weight of 100 lifetimes. She'd been brought here as a girl, sold away from her mother in South Carolina, her tiny hands already skilled with a needle and thread. Her gift had made her valuable not as a person but as property. She sewed gowns for Mrs. Whitmore and waistcoats for her husband, the master, and every stitch she placed was neat, perfect, and silent, just like her. But behind that silence, something darker was stitching itself together, a memory, a wound, and a promise. It began to winters ago. Louisa's younger brother, Samuel, had been caught sneaking bread from the kitchen. He was only 12, a child, starving. The overseer made an example of him. The memory of that day never left Louisa, the whip cracking, the laughter of white men, and Samuel's weak voice crying out her name before it all went quiet. That was the day something in her heart stopped feeling pain. It began to feel purpose. From that moment, Louisa vowed that the Whitmore family, every one of them, would one day taste what they had served to others for years, suffering. But revenge required patience, and patience was something the enslaved learned well. By the spring of 1854, Louisa had earned the trust of the mistress, Clara Whitmore, a woman who wore diamonds but hid cruelty behind her smile. Louisa made her gowns for every Sunday service, every grand dinner, and every tea gathering. Her sewing hands were her weapon now, delicate, precise, unseen. In the evenings, after the work was done and the other slaves lay exhausted in their quarters, Louisa would sit by the flickering candlelight, stitching, mending, planning. One night, as the cicadas hummed outside and the plantation slept, Louisa whispered to the darkness, "Samuel, I ain't forgot. I never will." Her friend Ruth, an older woman with kind eyes, looked over and sighed. "Child, you can't bring him back. Don't go doing something that'll bring the devil to your door." Louisa looked up, her eyes cold and steady. "The devil already lives here. Ruth, he wears fine clothes and drinks sweet wine." Ruth didn't speak again. She knew the truth when she heard it. A week later, Louisa was called to mend one of Mr. Whitmore's coats, torn at the seam after a hunting trip. While working in his study, she noticed something curious: a small wooden cabinet beside the desk, half open, filled with bottles of red wine. Imported, expensive, something the master drank every evening at dinner. An idea began to form, a dangerous one. That night, she found herself back in the kitchen where the cook, old Martha, was boiling herbs to make medicine for her aching knees. Louisa watched the pot bubble, the sharp scent of nightshade rising with the steam. She remembered the stories her mother once told her, how the earth held both food and poison, and sometimes they grew side by side. Louisa asked softly, "Martha, what does that plant do?" Martha squinted. "That there. Too much of it, and a man won't wake up come morning. Why you a skin, girl?" Louisa just smiled faintly. "Just wonder in how the Lord picks which plants to make deadly." In the following days, Louisa's movements grew more careful. Every task, every step, every glance was weighed. She had learned the art of invisibility long ago. Now, she used it as armor. Mrs. Whitmore praised her skill, even calling her "my little needle." Louisa would curtsy, eyes down, and whisper, "Thank you, ma'am." But inside, she thought, one day, "You'll wear what I sew, and it'll be the last thing you ever wear." The opportunity came sooner than expected. A grand dinner was being prepared for guests from Savannah, planters and traders, men who saw human lives as business. Mrs. Whitmore demanded a new gown for the occasion, a fine silk one trimmed with lace and ribbons. Louisa worked on it for 3 nights straight, her hands steady, her mind sharper than ever, and as she stitched the final hem, she reached for a small vial sheet hidden beneath her apron. the one she'd carefully filled with the extract Martha had unknowingly brewed. It wasn't enough to kill at once, but enough to weaken, to bring fever, to make them think God himself was punishing them. Louisa dipped the tip of her needle in the poison and sewed it into the lining, where the cloth touched skin. Every stitch was a prayer whispered under her breath, for Samuel, for Mama, for every soul that never got free. On the evening of the dinner, the house glittered with candlelight. The guests arrived in carriages, their laughter echoing across the fields. Louisa stood silently near the wall, serving wine, her eyes never leaving the master and Mistress Dotmer. Whitmore raised his glass, red as blood, and toasted to the good fortune of the South. His wife smiled beside him, radiant in the gown Louisa had made, her skin brushing against the poisoned thread. Louisa's heart pounded like thunder. She said nothing, moved like a shadow, and kept refilling their glasses. When the guests left and the house grew quiet, Mrs. Whitmore complained of dizziness. Her skin flushed red. The master cursed, thinking it was the heat. Louisa helped her upstairs, every movement calm, controlled. "Thank you, Louisa," Clara murmured, her voice trembling. Louisa tucked her in, smoothing the gown she'd crafted with her own hands. "You rest now, ma'am. You'll feel better come morning." But she knew the morning would bring something else entirely. Outside, beneath the pale moonlight, Louisa walked to the edge of the cotton fields. She looked toward the horizon where the slave quarters lay quiet and still. A whisper rose in the night, the wind through the cane, the faint cry of an owl, and somewhere, maybe, the voice of her brother. "You done good, Lou," it seemed to say. Louisa closed her eyes, tears tracing the lines of her cheeks. The first chain had been broken, silently, carefully, invisibly, and the Whitmore family had no idea that death had already been stitched into their silk. The night air hung heavy over the Whitmore plantation, thick, humid, and trembling with a silence that wasn't peace. Inside the grand white mansion, the walls gleamed with candlelight, but the house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Mrs. Clara Whitmore had fallen ill. It started with trembling hands, a fever that burned her pale skin, and eyes that fluttered with confusion. The doctor from town had been called, his buggy wheels rattling up the long dirt road before dawn. Louisa had watched from the servants' quarters window as the carriage arrived, her face unreadable, her heart steady as a metronome. She didn't need to ask what the doctor would say. She already knew. By mid-morning, the whispers began spreading like wildfire. "The mistress has taken ill," the other house servants murmured. "Poison, they say, or a fever from the swamp." Louisa kept her head down, folding linens in the laundry room, her fingers working with the same rhythm they always had. But her mind was far from the task. She could hear the master's boots pounding up and down the hallway, his voice echoing with anger and fear. "Don't just stand there. Get her water. Get the preacher. Do something, damn it." Louisa paused, listening. The sound of desperation in his voice was a melody she'd waited years to hear. By sunset, Clara Whitmore was bedridden, delirious, and gasping. The grand lady of the plantation, the one who once bragged about how well-trained her servants were, now clutched her bedsheets, whispering nonsense about fire, snakes, and shadows crawling beneath her skin. Louisa entered the room quietly with a basin of cool water. The doctor had already left, shaking his head and saying something about divine punishment and unexplainable ailments. The master sat by the bed, his face slick with sweat, his hands trembling as he held his wife's. "Clara, don't leave me now," he murmured. "You'll be fine. You'll be fine." Louisa dipped the cloth in the basin and wrung it out slowly. "Sir," she said softly, "would you like me to sit with her tonight?" He nodded absently, eyes glassy. "Do what you can, girl." She pressed the cool cloth to Mrs. Whitmore's forehead. The woman stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open just long enough to whisper, "Louisa, my skin, it burns." Louisa leaned close, her voice soft as silk. "Hush now, Miss Clara. Rest easy. The pain will pass soon." And in her mind she added, just as it passed for Samuel. The hours crawled by. The house grew still, except for the creak of floorboards and the occasional cry from the dying mistress. Louisa stayed by her side, expression calm, hands steady. But every minute that ticked by was a victory written in silence. By midnight, Clara Whitmore was gone. The master's roar shook the halls. A sound of grief and disbelief twisted together. No. God damn it. No. Louisa stood in the doorway, candle in hand, watching. For a fleeting moment, she saw the man behind the cruelty, broken, desperate, undone. But then she remembered Samuel's screams, and pity vanished like smoke in the wind. The next morning, the plantation was draped in mourning cloth. Black ribbons, black dresses, black hearts pretending to feel loss. The master withdrew into himself, drinking more each day, the sharp smell of wine lingering wherever he went. He no longer looked at Louisa, not out of suspicion, but because he didn't see her at all anymore. She was invisible again, which was perfect. Louisa knew she couldn't stop now. The first step of revenge had been taken. The poison she'd sewn into the mistress's gown had worked beautifully, but it wasn't finished. The master had yet to face his reckoning. She waited for the right moment, letting grief blind him, letting his sorrow turn into carelessness. And soon, that moment arrived. 2 weeks after the funeral, the master threw a dinner. A strange one, not a celebration, but a desperate attempt to restore his reputation among the neighboring planters. The grand dining hall was polished again, the silverware gleaming. He wanted to show that the Whitmore name was still strong, still proud. Louisa was there. As always, quiet, efficient, unseen. She moved between tables, serving dishes, refilling glasses. Her eyes never left the master's goblet. The same goblet he always used. The one engraved with the family crest, a serpent coiled around a branch. How fitting, she thought, when she carried the next bottle of wine to the table. She poured it carefully and slipped something into the goblet. A few drops of the same deadly extract she'd used before, but stronger this time. Enough to end a man's tyranny, not just his peace. She placed the bottle down and stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. Whitmore raised his glass again, just like that night 2 weeks ago. To my dear wife, he said, voice thick with drink, and to the good fortune of this house. Louisa watched the crimson liquid touch his lips, and for a moment time froze. But then he coughed. Once, twice. The guests turned concerned. His face turned pale, then red, his hand clutching at his throat. Henry? One of them said. Are you all right? He gasped, choking, his body trembling violently as he fell backward from his chair. Wine splashing across the tablecloth like blood, the guests screamed. The room erupted into chaos. Louisa dropped to her knees beside him, pretending to panic. Master, master, please, she cried, though her eyes were calm. He looked at her, his lips trembling, eyes wide with terror. For the first time, he saw her, really saw her. Why you? He gasped. Louisa leaned closer, her voice a whisper only he could hear. Yes, me. For Samuel, and then he stopped breathing. The doctor came again, the preacher too. But it was no use. By dawn, the master of Whitmore Plantation was dead. They called it a heart attack. Some said poison, others whispered it was God's punishment. Louisa said nothing. She just stood quietly near the window, watching the sun rise over the cotton fields. For the first time, it looked beautiful, like the world had been washed clean. But she knew the danger wasn't over. The overseer, Mr. Pike, was suspicious by nature. He'd been watching her, always had. That evening, he cornered her by the barn. You were with him both times, he said, stepping closer. When the missus died. When the master died. You think I don't see what's what? Louisa met his gaze, her face unreadable. You think I did something, Mr. Pike? He smirked. Don't play innocent, girl. I know you're clever, but clever don't last long out here. You tell me what you did. Maybe I let you live. Louisa stared at him for a long moment, then smiled, slow and deliberate. You won't live long enough to tell anyone. Before he could react, she swung the lantern she'd been holding. It smashed against his head, flames spilling across the hay. The barn caught fire instantly, smoke roaring to life as Pike fell, unconscious. Louisa ran. The fire spread fast, leaping from barn to stables, from stables to the house. Servants screamed, horses cried, and soon the night sky was glowing orange. Louisa didn't stop. She grabbed Ruth's hand from the quarters, shouting, "Now! We run now!" Dozens followed, men, women, children. They raced through the fields, hearts pounding, breath ragged. Behind them, the Whitmore plantation burned, its grand white walls collapsing in flame. Ruth gasped as they reached the edge of the woods. "Louisa, what did you do?" Louisa turned, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "I set us free. For 3 days, they moved through the backwoods, hiding from patrols, surviving on berries and stolen bread. Louisa guided them north, following the stars, the same stars her mother once told her to look for when freedom felt to. Far away, when they reached the river crossing near Augusta, they met a group of abolitionists, part of the Underground Railroad. They were taken in, fed, and hidden. Louisa stood by the river that night, looking at her reflection. The woman staring back wasn't a slave anymore. She was a survivor, a legend no one would write down, but whose whispers would live on. Ruth came up behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You done what no one else dared, child. You burned the devil's house." Louisa nodded slowly. "I didn't do it for glory. I did it for the ones they took." Years later, long after the Civil War ended and freedom had a name, people would still tell stories about the Whitmore plantation, about the night it burned, the master's strange death, and the girl who vanished like smoke. Some said she became a nurse up north. Some said she crossed the border into Canada and lived peacefully till old age. But those who believed in justice, they said she still walked the earth in spirit. A reminder that even the quietest woman can change history when her heart burns with enough pain. And if you ever pass through the fields of old Georgia, some say you can still smell smoke on the wind, and hear a whisper in the dark, "The chains are gone, and the house has fallen."